On December 7th, 1958, around 1:30 p.m., Kenneth and Barbara Martin of Portland, Oregon, would leave their home with their daughters Barbie, 14, Susan, 11, and Virginia, 13, in Kenneth's cream-colored Ford station wagon. The Martins' oldest son was currently in the Navy stationed far away in New York. The family planned to go to Columbia River Gorge to gather greenery for Christmas wreaths and decorations. However, they would never return. And 2 days later, when Kenneth didn't show up for his job at the local electric company, his boss Taylor Eccles would report him missing. What followed was a bizarre mystery that has still yet to be resolved. Police would initially search their home around 11 p.m. that night. They found the house undisturbed, clothes still in the washing machine, dishes left in the drying rack. Kenneth's Santa Claus suit was still laid out from the Christmas party they had attended the night before. Searches around the area would begin, but never provided any substantial leads to the fate of the Martin family. And with little to go on, they would try to retrace the family's movements that day. They would find out that sightings of the Martins were sparse. One witness, gas station owner Dean Baxter, reported they had bought 5 gallons of gas from his store in Cascade Locks, about 40 miles from their home, around 3 p.m. that evening. He said they headed east after buying the gas. They would be seen again shortly after around 4:30 to 5:15 p.m. by a waitress named Clara York, who served the family burgers and fries at the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River, about 20 miles further east of Cascade Locks. She noted that Kenneth was carrying 2 cameras. When they left there, they were on the road going back to Portland. Final reports from passing motorists indicated the family was along the north bank of the Columbia River in Washington, around dusk. And although law enforcement would continue to not find any sign of the Martins on their searches, a family friend would have come across something interesting. Donald Bain, after days of searching, would find fresh tire tracks leading to the cliff overlooking the river and the Dalles. He did not see any return tracks. Even more worrisome was the fact when he looked down, he saw cream-colored paint scrapings on the rocks below. He was unable to get down to reach a sample of the paint, but he did alert authorities, which was the Dalles PD, who would claim that it was not related to the case, and didn't even bother investigating it, and that would be a pattern that hindered the case in the early days of the investigation. In addition to that mistake, just a day after the family went missing, law enforcement came across a stolen white Chevy. The car sat abandoned next to the Columbia River Highway, at almost the same exact spot where the Martins' cream-colored Ford station wagon was seen the previous evening, and it too was originally dismissed by investigators as being connected to the disappearance. And making things even more bizarre and infuriating was the fact that a .38 handgun was recovered by passerbys near the white Chevy. It was covered in dried blood and was hidden under a rock. It appeared that someone had used the butt of the gun to beat someone else. It also contained a fired single-shell casing that was still in the chamber. The investigators would take the gun a few days and look it over before giving it back to the person who found it. I know this sounds crazy, but they had not yet realized the gun could be connected to the Martins. And this was in the days before forensic technology existed. The police could not connect it to anyone. But, as the early days showed, this investigation was mired in confusion and mistakes. And there was one simple reason for this. The case had multiple agencies involved, and none of them were talking or sharing info with one another. There was a sheriff's department working on the case on both the Washington state side of the river, as well as the Oregon state side of the river, as well as multiple city police departments, to be joined later on by the state police from both Washington and Oregon. So there were several investigators with different information and evidence coming up with various theories about what happened. And unfortunately, by the time the Hood River County Sheriff Department realized the gun could have been connected, it had already been released back to the person that found it and wiped clean. They were, however, able to trace the gun back to a Meyer and Frank department store. Police would then circle back to the white Chevy they first ignored, which again, due to confusion, they ignored because they didn't know it could be relevant. They would find out an ex-con named Lester Price had borrowed the car from a friend and never returned it. It was of course reported stolen by the friend. Investigators would receive multiple reports placing the white Chevy in the area the night of the disappearance. Price was also spotted with another ex-con named Roy Light. They had previously served time together at San Quentin, and Roy actually lived in the area. He lived only a couple hundred yards from where the car was thought to have possibly went over the cliff. In addition, the same waitress at the Paradise Snack Bar reported seeing both men there at the same time as the Martins, as well as seeing the men leave about the same time. Tips would pour in over the coming weeks and months, with over 200 letters and hundreds of phone calls. One call was from an orchard owner east of Portland, who saw a man and woman collecting greenery in a canyon the day they went missing. He said a week later he noticed buzzards flying around the canyon. Search and rescue would search all over the gorge, but found nothing. A few weeks later, a woman's glove was found near the abandoned stolen Chevy, which family stated was similar to something the eldest daughter Barbara would wear. However, no one could identify it for sure. As these cases typically go, sightings would start to pop up, placing the family all over the place. On New Year's Eve, a man called and said he saw the Martin speeding across Interstate 5 in Oregon. Highway Patrol were alerted, but did not spot the vehicle. A letter would come in a little after Christmas, in which the writer stated that he had seen a family resembling the Martins in Burlington, Iowa, nearly 2,000 miles away, while one of the last sightings came from a truck driver on January 7th, which he stated he seen a vehicle matching the Martins' description with Oregon plates in Billings, Montana, which is nearly 900 miles away. The paint chips that were recovered from the site were sent to the FBI for analysis, and it was determined to be the same paint used for the same model and make of the Martin station wagon. Investigators now believe they had plummeted into the river. The United States Army Corps of Engineers would come in and lower the level of the river by 5 feet in the lake behind Bonneville Dam. They would then search with sonar technology, but still could not find the vehicle. Despite the early incompetence of investigators, one detective did stand out for his role in the case. In fact, I liken him to some of the early film noir detectives. This man was Walter Graven. Even though the majority of law enforcement kept writing the case off as an unlikely accident, Graven kept slowly building a case. He was only finding circumstantial pieces of evidence, but things were coming together that indicated that this could not have been an accident. And even when he was told to stop investigating, he continued to in his off time. He had a deep sense of justice and wanted to see the Martin family avenged. He would work tirelessly on the case, and it's also that his notes that we know so much about the case today. His hard work would pay off eventually, as the Oregon State Police would come around and agree with Graven that the Martins were murdered, and they would ask for his help on the case. 3 months after the tire tracks were discovered, on May 1st, a river barge in the Dalles would reportedly hook something of substantial weight to its anchor, but it became dislodged before they could pull it to the surface. The men speculated that it was a vehicle, and the next morning, a fisherman and his wife would report seeing 2 bodies floating downstream near the Cascade Locks. They would call it in to authorities, and by that evening, the body of Susan would be discovered. She was on the north bank of Columbia River near Camas, Washington, 70 miles west of the Dalles. Her sister Virginia would be discovered the following morning near Bonneville Dam, about 40 miles west of the Dalles. Interestingly, when the bodies were taken to the medical examiner's office, one of the deputies recorded that they were bullet holes in the heads of each girl. However, according to the medical examiner, no such injuries were found, and instead ruled that both girls died from drowning. Traces of aluminum was discovered on Susan's clothing. This was especially noteworthy because the location where the anchor ensnared a submerged object sat directly across the river from an aluminum smelting plant. This same smelting plant was just a couple hundred yards away from Roy Light's home. They also found that the burgers and fries had been eaten around 2 hours before their death, meaning that the family died roughly around 6:30 p.m. The sheriff at the time, Rupert Gilmouth, would state that the sheriff department's belief was the barge's anchor had overturned the Martins' car at the bottom of the river, busted open a door, allowing the bodies of Susan and Virginia to escape to the surface downstream. There would be again searches by sonar and helicopter. Both proved unsuccessful. The search would eventually be called off, as the police agencies did not have the money to keep paying for the searches when they weren't even sure where the bodies could be. And to add to the fact, diving equipment was still primitive in 1959, and one of the rescue divers almost drowned searching for the vehicle. The remaining son, Donald, and the rest of the family never attempted to put another search party together after this, as doubt still lingered over whether this was a terrible accident or not. Detective Craven was convinced that it was a homicide, and there is a little evidence and witness testimony that backs this. For one, 3 years later, in 1961, a resident would write a letter to the Oregon Journal, stating they had parked with a companion in Cascade Locks on that night, when they witnessed the vehicle proceeding under the railroad tracks toward the locks. A few moments later, they would hear screaming. They went to investigate but found nothing. Typically though, one would question the validity of this account. I mean, it had been 3 years. What took so long to report that? However, this story comes off like it was a possible couple that went to a lover's lane to make out, and then they witnessed this. That would make sense to why they did not want to come forward, especially in 1958, but that's not the only evidence. One key thing to the case was the tire tracks. This indicated that it was almost certain the family's vehicle was deliberately pushed off the cliff. Another fact was that the family had been spotted at dusk on the north bank of the river in Washington state, while the tracks were on the south side of the river, meaning they were pushed after nightfall. So who is behind this? Interestingly, some early, although kept quiet, conjecture by Detective Graven seemed to indicate the oldest son Donald as the culprit, or at least the one who planned it. Remember when I said the gun recovered near the scene was traced to a Meyer and Frank store? Well, it turns out Donald had worked for one of these department stores. In fact, he had been fired from there before because he had got caught stealing from them. In particular, one of the items he was accused of stealing was the gun that would end up being found near where the stolen car was. He stole over $2,000 worth of goods, or in today's money, over $20,500 worth. He admitted to the theft and blamed it on a difficult time at home, as he had just came out as a gay man to his parents, and they did not approve, as they were very religious. They agreed to pay for the stolen items, and their son was released from custody. His parents then sent him off to a religious school in Connecticut, in hopes that he would become a minister, and not surprisingly, this didn't pan out, as he dropped out of school to join the Navy. But just because you're a thief, well, that doesn't mean you would murder your family, does it? According to the people that knew the family dynamics, it was apparent to all that there was tension between Donald and his parents. Donald even told Graven that his mom was a fat slob and his father was not much better, and that he feared his sisters would end up just like them. And what about the substantial amount of money Donald stood to inherit? Well, according to the financial documents from the time period, the Martins' bank account, life insurance policies, plus the home and land value, came out to around a total of $36,000, or about $360,000 in today's money. So it was a modest amount, just not as much as one would think for the crime. And another odd fact in all this was Donald didn't even return home until 3 months after his family disappeared, even missing his recovered sister's memorials, although he would state that he was given the wrong time and date for the service, thus explaining his absence. He also never showed any emotion due to the deaths of his family, and never bothered to help in the search efforts. His sisters would end up being cremated, and again, Donald would never bother to request for the ashes. Once he finally returned, he would settle the family estate and do an interview with Detective Graven. He would tell the investigator that he didn't know of any enemies his family had, but he did not believe that it could have been an accident. He would eventually move to Hawaii and get married and had 4 children of his own before passing in 2004. He would never speak to his family about what happened and declined all media interviews. However, we should remember that looking at Donald in the context of the disappearance, it could be considered that it's quite possible he simply cut his family out of his life due to the fact they disapproved of his lifestyle. And let's consider one more thing. Let's say Donald was behind it. We know there was no possible way for him to physically be there to do it. He was on a Navy base in New York. Numerous alibis. So this means he would have gotten Light and Price to do it. But how did he meet them? Why would he tell them to use a gun that he knew he had been accused of stealing before? Why take such a huge risk for an inheritance that would take almost a decade to get? And finally, how could he convince 2 ex-cons to do all this for a payout that they would not receive until a decade later? It's definitely a reach. So let's look at another angle. What if Donald had nothing to do with it? Is it possible that Roy, Light, and Price were just acting on their own? What did they have to gain? The waitress at the Paradise Snack Bar would say both convicts were there at the same time the Martins were there, and that the men left at the same time they did. And this is where the gun comes back into play. As stated before, when Kenneth found out that Donald was busted for theft of up to $2,000, which would have put him away for a few years, Kenneth paid the department store for everything that Donald had stolen, in exchange for the fact that they did not go to the police. But we're not sure what happened to the gun after this. When Donald was investigated by Graven, he told the detective that he had not stolen the gun when he got busted all those years before, that it was instead his roommate and co-worker named Wayne. Wayne is also an interesting person in this case. Some have insisted that he was Donald's lover. Others have insisted he was nothing more than a friend. Regardless, Donald would claim he never seen the gun, and instead pointed out that Wayne was a gun fanatic, and that Wayne had a friend working in sporting goods that would have turned a blind eye to Wayne snatching the gun. However, assuming that Donald did steal the gun, it is entirely possible that Kenneth kept the gun in his car for safety, and maybe Ken pulled out the weapon in self-defense when the men arrived, and was overpowered before he could shoot it. Or maybe Ken didn't grab the gun at all. Maybe the perps got a jump on him and isolated him and his family from the car, while they searched through it, then taking the gun, killing Ken, and beating the others before pushing the car over. But this has holes too. What was the motive? The Martins didn't have a lot of cash on them, and the credit card was never used again, indicating robbery was never the motive. Also, why throw the gun down near the car that Price had just stolen? It doesn't make a lot of sense. It's also just as possible that Donald kept the gun, and after making contact with the two ex-cons, was able to give them the gun to do it. If that happened though, no one is aware of a connection, and again, how did he convince these two to do it and then wait a decade for the money? And what happened to Lester Price and Roy Light after all this? Well, Price would get on a bus bound for San Francisco, and he would never be questioned about the Martin family disappearance. In fact, I could never find if he was ever apprehended for the car theft. Roy Light is a much more intriguing character, and after the Martin family disappearance, his name drops completely off the radar, never to be seen again. It's assumed now, although uncertain, that Roy Light was an alias for a fugitive named Richard Allen Hunt. Hunt was wanted for, and I'm not even joking here, kidnapping and assaulting with an attempt to commit murder of a police chief in Brownsville, Oregon. After a traffic stop, it seemed Hunt was able to get the drop on Chief McPhee, disarm him, put him in his car, and flee the scene. It was later down the road when they got far out of town that Hunt ordered the chief out of the car and left him there. The FBI Most Wanted list was not even 10 years old yet, and Hunt was one of the first people to make the list. He was later apprehended in Wyoming. Although it's believed he had numerous aliases, he never confessed to being Roy Light. He was released from prison a few years later, and it's there that his story ends. But there is still a significant amount of amateur sleuths today who believe this was nothing more than an accident. It's been pointed out that Kenneth had poor vision and was known by all of his relatives and friends to avoid driving at night, due to his inability to see hardly at all in the dark. But if we believe that, then why did he go out so late knowing he would get caught out in the dark? That doesn't make sense either. Detective Graven would pass in 1988 without solving the crime. His daughter would inherit his notebook full of thoughts on the case. When looking through it, she found a paragraph revealing what Graven believed to have happened. He stated that he was sure Kenneth was shot in the head and killed instantly. Then he would use the gun to beat Barbara and the girls into unconsciousness, and then push the vehicle over the cliff. Intriguingly, on the last page of Graven's notebook, he states, quote, "Had to be planned by Donald. No one else with motive," end quote. But Donald's name had been marked out by Graven. It wasn't until years later using software that investigators were able to see the marked out name. So just why did Graven mark it out? Unfortunately, that's a secret that he took with him. Most of my research has come from one book called Echo of Distant Water by J.B. Fisher. I highly recommend it if you are interested in this case. He has way more data than I could ever go over in a single video. And although I don't agree with his theory, which I won't spoil here, he makes a compelling argument to what he thinks really happened. That's all from me for now. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps immensely.